So yeah, I won't give a longer presentation. We have the pleasure today who's a professor at the University of Aberdeen, Scotland, soon to be retired actually, and who I had the honor to have as my supervisor for my PhD. But I guess for the rest, he will give an introduction. So yeah, the floor is yours, Phil.
Sure. Okay. So I'm Ehud, and I'm here to talk about human evaluation, which I think is really important, but needs to be done well, otherwise it's pointless. I'll also say.
Probably, sorry, need to click here. Yeah.
Okay. Right. Okay. So who am I? So I'm a professor of computing science at Aberdeen, retiring soon. I had the pleasure of supervising Simone's PhD work, among other people. I used to be chief scientist of a spin-out company, which I founded around 15 years ago. I'm working on language generation, special evaluation, and also healthcare, like forever, crazy amounts of time. If you want to know more about me, I have a personal blog you can read if you're interested. Also, I should say, in addition to this stuff, I'm also become recently an editor of the journal Tackle. Maybe you know it. So that context, whole question of like peer review, something I've become very interested in. So I know people are on peer review here. I'm interested to know what you think about it, because suddenly something I need to care about because of my, journal editor role. Anyway, so I've wrote a book last year. So if you want to know my thoughts on the world, you can read the book, which you can get for free on archive, by the way, you don't have to buy it. So anyway, it's the human evaluation. So obviously, as we know, most evaluation in NLP these days uses metrics, benchmarks, LLMs to judge. And there's tons of issues with this, contamination, saturation, construct validity, bugs. I'm sure you're very well aware of this. So benchmarks are hugely popular, but have lots of issues. And so I strongly believe that if we evaluate with people, it can give us more meaningful results, provided it's done well. And that's an important caveat, especially in things like medicine, law, finance, where we really care about that's correct. We need this kind of evaluation. Now here's just a simple example. This is a recent paper about, again, in the health space, which I'm very much interested in. So they wanted to know, can LLMs answer health questions, right? Like, I've got a high fever, what should I do, right? So they define some scenarios. What happens if you give the LLM the scenario, which does great. If you create an LLM that simulates a user, have the LLM simulate a user talk to the LLM medical bot, it works great. But if you have the LLM talk to an actual patient, it's terrible. And lots of unsafe things happen. Okay? So when we have LLMs by themselves, it looks great. When we stick a human in there, it's terrible because there's a lot of communication problems, right? The human doesn't understand the LLM doesn't understand the human. The point here, something here is that we need the humans involved to really know whether this works, right? You test the LLMs on their own, they seem to be great at answering health questions. But once you put a person in there, it's not nearly so good. And so that's why we need people involved. Just, one example, which is close to my heart because I do a lot of work in this kind of patient space. Yeah, so I'll go through a lot of different things. I may not get through all of this, but just let me know if we're running out of time and I'll hurry up. The first thing to say is that there's a lot of ways of doing human evaluation. So sometimes people don't realize it, they're not into this kind of field. We can ask people to give ratings, so read a text or whatever, give me a Likert rating 1 to 5, and say mark up problems, look at this output and tell me where it's wrong. You task-based evaluation. So we've done experiments where we give text to doctors and then say, okay, doctors make a decision. And then we see how good the decisions are based on the text. Or we can real world impact and deploy it for real and see what happens. So to make it more concrete, so I had a student back in 2022, Francesco, who works on what's now called medical scribe. Okay, so a medical scribe, you have doctor-patient consultation. Hello, how can I help you? I just had diarrhea the last 3 days, need to stay close to the toilet, et cetera, et cetera. And the scribe system takes that consultation and it summarizes it. 37 HX of diarrhea, aminowatery, no blood in the stool. Okay, so you're taking this doctor-patient consultation and you're summarizing it for the patient record. And this kind of thing, I mean, we did it in 22, it was still somewhat experimental, but now it's used by millions of doctors around the world. So it's very common technology. Anyways, from an evaluation point of view, the student Francesco did lots of evaluations. I think it's a nice example of different ways we can evaluate this kind of system. So first of all, he did metrics, tons of different metrics at the time, 2022. None of them were very good at predicting posts at a time. So what we really cared about was, in this system, the AI produced the draft summary and the doctor had to check it. So we cared about how long it take the doctor to actually do the checking, right? And so none of the metrics were great predictors of checking time. Actually, the best was the simplest. So lead machine distance, which is character level edit distance, was actually better than BERT score, mover score, Rouge, whatever, right? So I thought it was kind of interesting that the simplest metric was actually the best predictor of posts at a time. But anyway. So what about the human evaluation? Okay, so first of all, we went to doctors, say, doctors, use the system and give us a rating on a scale of 1 to 10 of how, of how good it is, right? And this was their opinion, right? Just simply saying, use the system and give us a rate 1 to 10. So it's just based on their opinion, right? And that's a rating evaluation where people just say, okay, I think it's a 3 or a 7 or whatever. In this case, we also went to the doctor, okay, doctors read the actual output of the system and mark up the mistakes, right? So they read this stuff and they marked it, okay, that's wrong, right? So they were actually annotating problems, okay? So that's an annotation evaluation. And, we had different ways of categorizing errors like the incorrect statements or omitted information, But the key thing was they marked up individual mistakes. Okay, third evaluation was tasks. So we had an experiment in a room where it said, okay, doctors come in, read this summary, fix it up, we're going to time you. Okay? This was done not really on the ward, but in a room like this, yeah. But as a way of estimating what it would take people to fix up the text, because that was a really important criteria for us. Okay, this is task performance, right? Give this text, I'm going to measure your performance on this task of editing it. And finally, we deployed it for real. So actually, real doctor used it with real patients during real consultations for like 6 months. And, turned out that it was actually help, but not that much. They had about 9% decrease in, the time taken by the time the doctor needed to post-edit the computer summary was 9% less than the time you need to write it from scratch. So it helped, but not that much. It actually was not cost effective. So the system wasn't used. Actually, this number is interesting because just as a side note, so this was an old system, right? This was done by fine-tuning a BART model. So obviously the technology is much better now. But when people do this kind of study now in 2026, you are still getting, well, it's quite rare. Some people say it's 20%. Some say it's negligible. So we're still seeing overall, despite the fact that our technology in 2026 is so much better, that number hasn't changed very much. And there's still, it depends on the context, right? Some contexts it's good, but some contexts it's totally useless. So yeah, I think it's interesting that despite the fact that tech has gone much better, this number, depending on the context, may not have changed very much. So what maybe the issue is the human, not the AI. I don't know, for those of you thinking about human AI collaboration. Anyway, so just saying very briefly, so if we're doing human evaluation, we can say, tell us what you think, rate on a scale of 1 to 10. We can say, find the problems. We can say, do some kind of task with it, and we can measure your task performance, or we can deploy it in the real world and then see what happens. And generally speaking, from my point of view, that The real world is the best, but that's really hard to do. The rankings are probably the least useful, but that's the easiest to do. And these things are in the middle. So in my group now, we do a lot of annotation stuff, right? We seem to have decided that annotation is a good compromise between being more meaningful than ratings, but easier to do than impact. But depends what you're trying to do. Okay, any questions or? Okay. So that was the first bit. So the second thing I wanted to make was just this point of the evaluation has got to be, human evaluation has to be done well, otherwise it isn't worth anything. So I'll give you a case study that we did of taking a really bad human evaluation and improving it. Okay. Yeah, some evaluations are great, some are bad. Okay, so this was in the domain of what's called data to text, we've done a lot of work on. And what we were trying to do, I'll just show you. So this was sports summaries. We got in, system was given data about this is an American basketball match. So you have data about the teams and how many points they scored and usual kind of things for basketball. Also at the player level. And then the system makes a sports summary, which like for media context. And so the question here is, okay, how many mistakes are there in this summary, right? How can we evaluate how good this summary is? So when we started working in this area, there was a standard protocol that had been developed by a guy named Wiseman, who first introduced this problem. And he basically, what it looks like is he went to mechanical turkers, which I think is being vanishing now. I think it's prolific, right? You got crowd workers. And he basically said, okay, crowd workers, probably can't read this right, but read a sentence and tell me how many things are wrong in it. Okay? So that was kind of the standard evaluation protocol in this space when we got into it. And it turns out that this is a really, really bad way of evaluating these texts, right? So this is a replication study that we did, where we tried to we took a result that was published in a paper, actually in Tackle, and then we got 2 labs to replicate it, and then 1 lab did a further replication. And the point you get to look at the number. This is the mean number of errors actually in a corpus text, doesn't matter. The original paper said this number measured using this protocol was 0.07. First application said it was 0.66. Second says 1.525. Oh, and then 0.0625. Using different annotators. We think the actual number is about 0.5. But the point is, these numbers are so variable, it's meaningless, right? This protocol, numbers that you get are so all over the place. It's just worthless, right? It's garbage. It's garbage. And I think this is a particularly bad example, but it's just, there are human evaluation protocols out there which basically don't tell you anything. They're just, they give you numbers, right? Numbers don't mean anything. Why doesn't it work? So it doesn't work. It gives you very different results. You can't trust it. That's very clear. Why? Because the task is very complicated. It's not very well defined to the people who are doing the annotation. And also the people doing annotation, the crowd workers are just, they don't care. They don't know what's going on. They're just like not taking it seriously, probably. So anyway, so we saw this and we said, right, we want to do this properly. We want to come in and do a proper evaluation of these basketball texts, right? So we developed a new protocol. I won't go into great detail. You can read the papers if you want, but it's based on annotation. So rather than counting, they actually have to mark up. I'll show you what it looks like, right? So whereas in the old protocol, you count errors. In this one, you actually mark up that the 2 is wrong, that's wrong, that's wrong. All the things that are right or wrong. This is quite a made-up example just to show things that go wrong. But For example, the Grizzlies had a strong first half, where they outscored the Suns 59-42. If you look at the actual data, in the first half, actually, the Suns had more points than the Grizzlies. So, this is like, pure hallucination. Right? Anyway, the point is that in our protocol, the annotators go through and they carefully read this text and they mark up things that are wrong. And it works, okay? We did lots of tests on this, lots of replications, very good annotated agreement. So I'm confident this is actually a good way of measuring hallucinations in this space, right? The old technique is a really pointless way using garbage data. This is a good way, right? So we've gone from a really poor way of evaluating the stuff, human evaluation, to a really good one. So why was it? Sorry, I should say, so it was annotation based. We also went very much more choosy about the subjects. So it wasn't random turkers. We actually people had to have expertise and pass a qualification test. We gave them lots of examples. We supported them if they had questions, and so we actually, it worked a lot better. So why is it better? Because annotation is better than counting, right? B, because the annotators, in our case, they're motivated and knowledgeable, they have lots of support, documented examples. All spent a lot of effort just, piloting the process and simplifying it. But anyway, so I'm just saying, the point is just trying to make, sorry?
One question.
Yeah.
So in your new protocol, how did you end up then with a single number in the end? So the 0.5 you showed?
We counted. So, I mean, we actually, the raw hallucinations are more interesting to examine what goes wrong. But these numbers are based on simply counting, right? We just count the number of mistakes.
Okay.
So the annotators don't do the counting, we do the counting. The annotators say what's wrong, but then we actually count.
Okay, so you don't take like severity of error into account?
No, not on this one. I mean, in other projects, we do actually annotate severity as well, but not on this basketball one.
Okay, thanks.
Maybe I will propose any questions at the end because we started a bit late for example. So at the end we can have all questions.
Yeah, but we've done some medical for example, when I told you about the medical scribe system, right? That's a good example, right? So, sorry. Okay, so in this system, the annotations were marked by severity. And then this mistake, who cares? This mistake might kill the patient, right? Because that's often very important. Okay, okay, so all I'm just saying is, we had a really bad protocol, we made a much better one, and the point is simply that these evaluation protocols, sometimes I read papers and they without human evaluation. Well, but it has to be a good evaluation. And so you have to take it seriously and you have to assess the protocols and improve them and refine them, as you do with benchmarks, right? These days with benchmarks, we assess the benchmarks, we improve them, and we have to do the same thing with human evaluation protocols, right? So our technology evolves very fast, our benchmarks are also evolving, and the human protocols also need to evolve and be assessed by themselves. Okay, so that was how I did. Okay. So,
sorry, can I ask a question, Ehud?
Okay,
This is
sure.
Irina.
Sure.
So for assessing the protocols, we also need a protocol. You understand?
Sure.
So what are the criteria how I can assess a given protocol if it's good or bad?
Yeah, so we do it by replication, right? So we do it by annotated agreement and also getting people to replicate the protocol. So this is kind of, so if you replicate the protocol and you're getting the same numbers more or less, that's a good protocol. That's the simple version. Replicate and get weird numbers at all over the place, and it's a bad protocol.
So are you saying that the only criterion is replicability, or is there more criteria involved?
I mean, you can do it in other ways. We also look at things like, inter-annotator agreement is also a good check. But I'm saying, for me, the bottom line is the best way to evaluate a protocol is replication for a human protocol. But yeah, we can also do a lot of things like inter-annotator agreement checks. That also helps. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, I mean, I got like the answer is replicability and inter-annotator agreement. These are the criteria. I mean,
Yes.
this is important in practice because if I propose a new protocol, I need to argue that this one is good. But then there's a question, how do I argue this? And what are the criteria? How we distinguish good and bad,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
And yeah, okay.
Yeah. I mean, if you're interested, the relevant paper from Craig Thompson goes into this in great detail. So that's probably the best source to look at that kind of stuff. Anyway, so talking about replicability, I just wanted to go on to the next bit of the talk, which is that we see a lot of bugs in human evaluation, which concern, it's not just human evaluation, right? So we had a project which ran called ReproHum, where we got a bunch of labs to replicate previous evaluations, and that's where the idea I just showed you comes from. So we took evaluations that published in good venues and got them replicated twice, including the example I showed you before of the really bad one. And I won't go into detail, but I'll just say it's a very depressing exercise for me. I mean, some of the protocols were not replicable at all, which was depressing. But even worse, we found that people actually didn't want to help us, because usually when you replicate an experiment, you have to ask for help from the people who did it. I mean, they give you GitHub repos, but usually it's not enough. You need some help from them. And so we asked people, can you help us replicate your study? And less than 20% actually said they would. Of those, actually, maybe half of those, maybe 10% actually gave us the information that we needed. So it was really very bad, right? It was, people didn't want us to help us replicate their work. And then sometimes they couldn't. And that's just really bad that people, to me, that was shocking, right? That there was so little interest. I mean, if someone comes to me, people have done this, people come to me and say, I want to replicate your work. I'm very keen and try to help them, but that seems to be, anyway, not the usual attitude. But the thing I want to talk about here, we also saw that there were a lot of flawed execution, right? Not design. A protocol is the design. Execution is how you actually run the experiment. And so a lot of problems there. And I think some of these apply to also to metric evaluations. So for example, we saw cases where the numbers in the paper didn't match the data, right? So we had the data from the application or from the original paper, and then we saw the numbers in the paper and didn't match what the paper said, did not match what was in the data. We saw code bugs in the code used from the experiment was buggy, and so the results were flawed. Lots of problems with outliers being dropped inappropriately to make results look better. For humans, and also bad user interfaces, which confuse people, and ethical problems. So again, there's a paper you can read for more detail, but just to give you a flavor. So this is a code bug, right? So, okay. This is a bit of code that's used to run a human evaluation. So you're taking in essentially output files from your goals, your baseline, blah, 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 and you're preparing a fast mechanical Turk. Okay. And it's buggy. What's the bug?
System 3. System 3 is taking the system 2 file.
Yeah. Okay. This should be sys3, right? You know that it should be sys3, not sys3. So basically, when you run the experiment, the Turkers are going to see sys2 twice. They're never going to see sys3. Okay. Now, when you think about it, right, this is it. such an easy mistake to make, right? You know, you're all writing code and you're copying and pasting, and this guy was probably copying and pasting the lines, and he just copy and pasted and forgot to update. This is, you know, it's a really easy mistake to make, right? And you know, I suspect that there's a lot of this out there, right? So we know from, you know, if you look at the commercial software development world, we know that even if you're really good software testing quality assurance, you might get one, you still have like 1 or 2 bugs per 100 lines of code. And most research, at least in my lab, I don't know about, I assume in your lab, most research code does not go through commercial software testing, right? So we're going to have more than 1 or 2 errors per 100 lines of code. And so I think this is a really big problem, right? We have the code that we use to run our experiments, and you know, with metrics as well as human is buggy, and that's sorting the results. And other people have reported similar findings. So yeah, nobody talks about this, but it worries me that we're relying on numbers that may be based on buggy code, and nobody ever checks the code. And you know, just say that the benchmarks are also buggy. So there's a classic case maybe you've heard of. There's this benchmark called MMLU, which is very popular a few years back for evaluating LLMs. And it wasn't only in research papers, like the media would talk about it, right? They read articles in the media about this, you know, the latest GPT gets this MMLU score. But a lot of it was wrong, right? I mean, there's multiple choice, and a lot of the answers were actually, you know, wrong. You know, it said the benchmarks, the answer is C, and the answer would actually B. You know, what's really depressing is even when this became clear in 2024, I still was seeing like the media and even research papers cite this benchmark. So anyway, so there's lots of problems with benchmarks, and including that a lot of them are just not very well debugged. They're just buggy. Okay, so what do I tell people? What's my advice is to do a sanity check, right? So if you are, however you're doing your evaluation, whether it's humans or metrics, actually eyeball some of the actual, don't just look at the numbers, don't say, okay, I got a 0.3 versus 0.25. Look at the actual raw evaluation results, right? So if you're evaluating text, how well did this text score, right? And just see if you see any weird patterns, you know? So most of the mistakes that we've seen could have been spotted if people had actually looked at the raw evaluation results and just see if it made sense, but there was like really weird stuff going on. So yeah, so all I'm saying is run an evaluation, eyeball the outputs, and just see if they look sensible or if they look kind of weird. And then if they look weird, check it out. Okay, and yeah, it's not just in AI, in medicine, we have, you know, this was a paper which was really scary, right? So this is again in medicine, not in computing, but he was looking for flaws in paper sent to a medical journal. And when he read the paper, he found 2% were wrong. Then he got his hands on the actual data behind the paper, and then 44% were wrong. So when he got his hands on the data, suddenly almost half the papers were wrong. So yeah, to really assess the paper, you need to see the data. Of course, in NLP, we never see the data, right? It's unheard of to see the data. Anyway, so just, yeah, just be careful, right? If you're doing your evaluation, just, yeah, be careful. I guess that's what I'm trying to say. Okay,
Yeah, we got time.
okay. So next bit, just your evaluation of subtle LLM problems. So I thought what I'm trying to say here is that, you know, there's a lot of subtle problems with LLMs that I think really need human evaluation. So start with the project that Simone did when he was my PhD student. You can jump in if you want, but so Simone asked cloud workers to provide 2,500 dietary struggles and then asked GPT to respond to the struggle, then asked nutrition experts to say if this is a good response. And, found lots of problems. Like, user says, well, I'm stressed out and what like is food and drink. They aren't good for me because eating makes me feel better. ChatGPT says, starting from tomorrow, you can make a conscious effort to make healthier choices when it comes to food and drink. And the expert said, this is a really bad response because someone is stressed. You don't tell them to try harder, right? You don't tell someone who's stressed need to try harder. It just makes them more stressed, more depressed. Okay. So it's not that it's wrong. It's not hallucination. It's just not a good thing to tell somebody who was stressed out. And then we found lots of this. I think it was 15% of responses were not appropriate or not safe, mostly because of this kind of thing. Most of them weren't wrong. They were just, not helpful, make you feel bad, control behavior. I'll just say we've seen this in lots of other healthcare domains. I thought I'd talk about this one because it's Simone's work, but we've seen this in lots of other projects as well, where the chatbots give you stuff that's not wrong, but not something you want to say to a patient. And and I think again, this was done with human evaluation, right? By asking experts to do it, and we've again found in general, we need to ask domain experts to evaluate this kind of thing. The models are not very good at doing it on their own. Here's another case where and again, in the medical space, where we're seeing very subtle errors. So, actually, this one, maybe it's a bit too subtle, but this is, we're trying to summarize basically a complex medical document for a patient. And the document says all this stuff here, PSA 612, CTA, post-op PSA, whatever. And GP4 says your current PSA level is 6.2, which is elevated. So basically, the PSA started off quite high, then an operation and became much better. The GPT kind of can't figure this out, so it gives a bad answer. Anyway, so I should mention one thing we're doing a lot of now in my group is more qualitative evaluation, because we're seeing that we're trying to find out a lot of the problem we see in the health space with people using LLMs is the LLMs aren't doing what they want them to do. So we're doing lots of work where we actually have focus groups, interviews, that kind of thing, try to find out what people think of the system, and if is it kind of meeting their needs. And I think this is really good, and it gives you really good insights as to what's wanted that go much beyond what you get out of an LLM. So, I mean, for example, we were running focus groups to tell us things and using, GPT to help patients, and, lots of stuff like people don't trust it, too much jargon, not very helpful, very superficial. And again, this comes from asking clinicians and patients to discuss something, right? I don't think you get this from an LLM as a judge. You have to ask the people involved what they think of it. And again, we've done another study where we were trying to evaluate the system by analyzing basically user feedback. We had lots of real world user feedback and analyzed it and discovered really unexpected things. So I also saw some nice work recently on question answering, where they were trying to evaluate spoken machine translation. And again, the metrics say it's great, but they got people to answer questions. So basically, you translate the source language, the target language, then ask the recipient to answer questions like how many days has the person had symptoms, right? So the patients that have all these problems, gets translated into Japanese or whatever. Then the Japanese person says, tries to answer these questions. And, it was not very good, right? So this kind of question answering seems to be a better predictor of usefulness than running metrics. Anyway, I won't belabor the point. What I'm trying to say here is just the language models, they can make really subtle mistakes, and it's not just hallucination. They can be accurate but harmful because they make people more depressed. They can be accurate but just not very useful, like the patients told us, this doesn't help us. It's just It's not that it's wrong, it's just not very helpful. Or they can be inaccurate in very complicated ways, like with this PSA thing. And we can try, all these cases, we try to use LLM as a judge, not have a lot of success in detecting it. Maybe we're just stupid, right? Maybe you could do it better, right? But we haven't had much luck. So I think we need high quality evaluation to pick up these subtle mistakes. Okay, and then so the last bit, I think I'm more or less on time.
Yeah.
Okay.
We started 5 minutes late, so still have
Okay.
10, 15 minutes. Maybe.
Okay. So let me talk about is impact evaluation, which is something which is quite close to my heart, right? So I think that it's really important to evaluate AI systems by putting them out into the real world and seeing what happens, like we did with the medical scribe system. So we take our medical scribe or whatever, we tell doctors use it and see what happens, right? Does it help their KPIs, their key performance indicators, and does it get worse? And there's additionally, there's obviously the huge excitement now about coding. So if I use Claude to write your code, right? And tons of people are excited, and it can do really great in lots of contexts, especially if it's people who are doing it for research purposes or for their own use. But if you go into a commercial context where the code has got to be very high quality, sometimes it doesn't seem to help that much, right? I mean, I've seen papers, again, the technology moves very quickly, but things saw papers last year that said, didn't help that much. It made things worse if you're trying to do commercial high quality code. And so that help is marginal, like as you saw with medical scribe, it helps, but not very much. So to really try to assess if we deploy this in a real world context, is it going to help? We have to do it right. We actually have to do it. Say, okay, we're going to actually measure our scribe or measure our Claude code and to see does it actually help people. And of course, context matters. So, maybe our scribe or our Claude code, it's great in some contexts, but it's horrible in others. So it matters what we're using it for, what the UI is, what the workflow is, whether people are trained, whether people accept it, right? So one common problem that we've seen in cases is people just don't want to use the AI because maybe they think it threatens their jobs, whatever. And so if users are hostile to the AI, it's not going to help them. It's not going to be very effective, right? But anyway, so for measuring impact, it's very context specific, right? We can't measure impact in general. Say, okay, in this particular context, what's the impact? So how do we measure it? And, my paper goes into this in more detail, but, we can do a randomized controlled trial, like we do in medicine a lot, A/B tests, very similar, pre-post, which is like the scribe thing where you measure productivity before and after you do the scribe, or observational. So just to give one example, right? So run a trial. Many of you have probably heard of this. What you do is you have a bunch of subjects, put into different groups. This group uses the AI. This group does not use the AI. Then you measure your KPI, like time taken to write up your medical note or whatever. Okay? And I did it randomized and blinded. And certainly in healthcare and medicine, this is the gold standard, right? If you want to advise something in healthcare, you have to do it this way. Otherwise, they won't take you seriously. And so, for example, we did this actually quite a long time ago, 25 years ago. We did this with this system to have smoking cessation. So we built a system which gave people advice how to stop smoking. And so we had an RCT, we recruited 2,500 people, and 1/3 of people got our AI produced letter, 1/3 got just a fixed letter, 1/3 got just a thank you letter. And then we measured the KPI, which was did they stop smoking 6 months later? And it turned out that it actually didn't work. Kind of embarrassing. The best high cessation rate was actually in this group, right? So the AI letter actually had either didn't help or made things worse. So that was kind of depressing. But you see the idea, right? You take your AI system, people use it for real, gets a control, and you measure the outcome. I'll say one thing that really frustrates me is this kind of thing is incredibly rare in the NLP literature. I did a survey of ACL ontology, and I found that 0.1% of the papers in the anthology did this, 1 in 1,000, which I thought was really depressing. I mean, you can't always do it this way, but you should do it this way some of the time, and more than 1 in 1,000.
So out of all papers or out of papers that are actually applicable in real world?
So this was out of all the anthology papers. I downloaded the anthology and basically did various searches and then checks to see. And I found 1 in 1,000 had this.
Okay, just so not all of them can
Sure.
have this kind of.
Sure, like a theory paper or whatever, a lot of papers, it doesn't make sense, right? But still, I think 1 in 1,000, even if you take into consideration, I think 1 in 1,000 is still much lower than I think it ought to be. But you're right, a lot of the papers makes no sense. I didn't do any filtering, it's just a raw count. But yeah, so it shouldn't be 100%, but I think it should always be 1%, maybe even 5%, not 0.1%. Actually, just going back to your question, this was more common in industry tracks, right? So industry track, which all applied, had more of these. But the funny thing was, it didn't actually talk about it very much.
Mm-hmm.
Like you have a paper which would spend a page and a half carefully describing a metric evaluation, then in one paragraph actually describe an impact evaluation. So they did it, but they barely mentioned it. But even so in that case, in the industry track, they would do it, but like barely mention it, which is also kind of weird. But anyway, I want to see more of these and properly explained, and you can read my rant about it. That's kind of a rant about this if you want. And I say, the real world is very messy, very noisy. We think our system's going to do great. We run the benchmark. We deploy, say, a medical scribe. Doesn't actually help very much, right? So I think, if we want to understand real world utility, we have to actually measure it in the real world. And so we go around saying AI is changing the world. This is the next industrial revolution. Will change everything. Blah blah blah. So I really believe that we should be measuring it, showing that yes, we are changing the world. Okay, and just some final thoughts. Yeah, I mean, I think we need human evaluation done well because it's the best way to evaluate what happens in the really messy world with messy people involved. And it's the best way to pick up these really subtle problems like people get confused or the advice is accurate but not appropriate. People don't really want it. So again, I think getting people involved is the way to really find out these issues. My advice, if you're doing human evaluation, consider doing annotation. Impact is better, but that's a lot of work. Annotation, I think, is better than asking for ratings. Make sure your human subjects or annotators are good. So if it's something like medicine, it should be people with clinical knowledge. Give them guidelines and trainings, and above all, treat them like partners, not lab rats, right? And a lot of people using like prolific, right? It's like the annotators are lab rats, and they're almost like machines, right? They're almost treated like machines, like like LLMs, right? You just give them data and get an output. And we've always tried to treat our annotators as people, right? And support them and help them and encourage them. And I think that makes a big difference. Remember, you're dealing with people, not LLMs. And also plan carefully. Sometimes people just kind of try to wing it, and I think you can wing it, but I think if you plan carefully in advance, it tends to be much better, right? So think in advance of what you're doing and have a good plan. And just in general, whatever kind of evaluation you're doing, whether it's humans or metrics, just do it well. I think there's so much focus on doing things cheaply and quickly. It's really not very good for science. So if you care about doing good science as opposed to, marketing how great our LLM is, whatever, we need to have really good evaluations, right? Which are well designed, well executed, well reported. Remember, we've seen papers where the numbers don't match the data, right? We've seen code bugs, so we need to be very careful about this kind of stuff so that we're actually measuring what we care about. Otherwise, it's not really very meaningful science. So it can be great marketing if you're OpenAI or something. Okay, so I think that's it. Yeah.
Now there's time for a question. I guess Eva.
Thank you for the talk. So my question is about yes, we need to do better human evaluation, especially like in mental health and healthcare and all this. But there's the trade-off between you don't want it also to be very demanding that because you want enough annotations and enough instances so that you could train your model to evaluate and get your paper accepted. Like some of these tasks, sometimes they take, let's say in mental health, 40 minutes to read like a dialogue and then annotate this. So how do we handle this kind of trade-off that I want a lot of annotations, but I don't want the human evaluation to be so demanding that I cannot get that number?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. I mean, I've seen, so we're doing human evaluation, that limits the amount of data we can get, right? Because we can't get that many humans, right? That's just the way it is. And
what you say about rating versus annotation, also with rating, I would get also more, even with the human evaluation.
Yeah. So I guess my personal view is that a high quality human annotation with a small number of subjects is going to tell me more about how good something is than a really large metric evaluation or human evaluation. But it is a challenge to get it accepted. That's true. I mean, I've seen a lot of people complain to me that they do these human evaluation, they spend lots of time on it, and the viewers don't like it. And that is a real problem. But I was giving someone advice recently. He thought it was a really large human evaluation, and it was, right? His subjects were spending like 5 hours each. And they were all like, professionals, like doctors and lawyers spending 5 hours each. And he had I think 40 of them. He said, I got 40 doctors and lawyers to spend 5 hours. Isn't that a big evaluation? And it is, right? When you submit it to a conference, people might say it's not. So anyway, it's a problem. I mean, we should take this. I think it's really meaningful, but it is hard to get it accepted in a lot of cases, and that's a real problem.
Yeah, so thank you for the talk. I have a question. So in general, it is really expensive to hire human annotators, right? So what do you think about pre-annotate with LLMs, for example? Is it worth to do, or especially because you also give a bias into the data, right?
So I think if you're going to use LLM annotators, I think what can work, I think you need to do some human as well. So what you can do is do some human annotation and do a larger scale LLM annotation and see if you're getting a good agreement. I mean, I tend to think that the LLMs are not very good at picking out the really subtle problems, but of course they do give you the scale, which the reviewers want. So maybe that's a good compromise. So I would never use it. I would never just use an LLM annotator, but it would make sense often to have some human annotation, but then a lot more LLM annotation to expand it and checking things like an agreement between humans and LLMs.
But sorry, I think he meant another thing. You meant
like
more
AI assisted annotation.
Yeah, I think more like pre-annotation.
So they can accept.
Then you must edit the annotation of the LLM to lower the workload.
Efficiency.
Yeah. That's not something I've had a lot of experience with, but I think that you lose a lot of information that way. because the human is going to react to what the LLM annotates, and so they because they're focusing on that, you may miss things. But it's not something I have a lot of experience with. But my limited experience is that it's not always very reliable. But it is possible, that is very true.
I think there is some work on this with translation that shows that when you like hire humans to do translations from scratch versus post-edit, there's a shift in terms of the kind of translations that you get, for example.
There's also the point you made about bias. What the humans now annotate bias, but what the LLM annotated, they don't see other problems or so.
Yeah.
I think it depends on task as well.
Yeah. The issue is you'll miss the subtle things, right? There's a subtle kind of error which the LLM pre-annotator misses. And the idea world, the human annotator still picks it up, but the human is focusing on what the LLM does.
I mean, I think there are two different kind of things. The first thing is that I just highlight the things that could be annotated, and then the other thing is I let the LLM annotate, and then just let the what the LLM annotates then prove if it's correct or not, right? Where I only have precision but not recall.
Yeah. But then there's also the problem of omissions, right? So at least in the medical space, omissions probably matter more than hallucinations. So I guess LM can suggest omissions, right? But is the person going to find omissions which were not marked up by LM? I don't know. Again, I don't have a lot of experience with it. I would be cautious.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks.
I think
First of all, thank you for the time. From my limited research experience, I think I saw a kind of a paradox in one of the things you've been describing, and that is, on one hand, we have a problem that is reviewers kind of give advantage to novelty and benchmark beating results in evaluation for both humans and AIs. On the other hand, I am sure that every kind of evaluation that has ever been done in the history of science, if put under the right lens, can be proven wrong or deconstructed. So I guess my question in this regard is, how, as new coming authors into the field of science, reconcile this paradox into results that are fair, honest, but also publishable?
So certainly no evaluation is perfect. That's absolutely true. I guess what I'm trying to say is you should try to do it as well as you can and do sanity checks and have careful designs. So yeah, you'll still make mistakes, but you as a scholar should try to do it carefully.
So as a follow-up, would very honest reporting on the evaluation structure be enough to ensure at the very least that the structure is considered fair and honest?
So you mean like in a paper?
Yes, because I mostly see, I've been, let's say, dealing with literature that claims something that when put under scrutiny gets proven false by a very high degree. And all this literature does is never commenting very much on how the experiment was structured or how that evaluation was conducted.
Yeah.
It's kind of a gray area.
Yeah. So I mean, there's two issues, right? So one is the actual experimental design, and yeah, so that ideally that's carefully described, but also carefully checked by the reviewers, which may always happen. And the other issue is the execution, right? As I said, we see lots of execution errors, and that's never described in the paper. So I guess even if it's the danger, even if the experiment is very carefully designed and that's written in the paper and checked, there still may be serious execution problems.
Thank you so much.
So I mean, ultimately, we can get back to replication. I suppose is the really. So okay, if you go back to medicine, say, because you do some work in medicine. In medicine, if it's a really important result, you expect to be replicated, and that's taken very seriously. And I mean, we talk about replication. We don't do it that much yet, but maybe in the long run we do more of it, because that is really the best way of seeing is this result meaningful.
Thank you so much.
Okay, that helps you hopefully.
Nobody has another question. I get. Okay, you go.
I think these days people are starting to use like reinforcement learning also in domains which are not verifiable. And in reinforcement learning, we could use a evaluation protocol that is very good and very sound directly to improve the model. Do you think some of the ideas that you presented like will transfer to this domain where we basically continually update the model based on a good evaluation?
Yeah, I mean, I guess like when I first started doing like RLHF, it was obviously always people in the loop, but now it's usually just like with other reward signals. So I don't know. I mean, to me, it seems like you're probably losing something, but it's not something I'm not an expert in reward modeling. Maybe there needs to be some care about are the reward signals meaningful, but it's not something I'm really an expert in.
Okay.
But yeah, I have noticed a really big shift. Like when they first started doing RLHF, I thought, wow, great, they're getting people to train the models, which seemed like a great step forward. And then, oh no, if people aren't enough, we're going to train our reward models and use those, and then you're making it more indirect and possibly losing something. I don't know, and maybe that, you were saying there's some really bad behavior of like conversational bots for people to get attached to them inappropriately. Maybe that's coming from inappropriate reward models. I don't know. Again, it's not really my expertise, but we are saying from a safety point of view, some nasty things which maybe can be traced back to reward models. Yeah.
So I'm going to be a bit more catastrophic. The point is, of course, you say many people don't evaluate real world impact. The point is that it's very hard to obtain real world impact. Like what you do with the stop paper is an outlier. Publishing in a journal, a paper that an approach that spectacularly fails is never going to pass an ACL comp. Like negative results are seen very badly. So it's hard for a researcher to be encouraged into doing this because you know that if you're just prompting LLMs, chances are in the real world that it does little to or nothing, and then it gets rejected. That's the problem.
It is certainly true that if you do a real world impact study, it's a huge effort, and you may well find that it doesn't work. I mean, we've certainly seen other cases when, I think you've seen it, right? When you try to do a real impact study and it doesn't work. And then it's not impossible to publish. Like, the smoking paper, we published that in ECF, right?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, I remember actually, because this was 25 years ago, right? So I was actually on the committee that met to decide, we met in person in those days, right? So we met in person to decide on which papers got accepted. So that when they came up to my paper about this negative result, told me to leave the room. And I left the room and I was sitting there for like 10 minutes while they argued. And finally decided to take it, but clearly it was quite an argument about it. So I think it would be nice if negative results were more accepted. And people like, say, Anna Rogers have also talked about this. And we now have workshops on negative results. And, in medicine, it's much easier to publish a negative result. And hopefully it's so much the same would true of NLP because, if you do a real evaluation, it may not work. And you hope that could be published. And I wish it was easier to publish because you're right, it's harder to publish, which is not good. Again, this gets into the whole research culture of the NLP community, which is a different topic. Yeah.
Yeah. Is it research culture or is it like a set of rules and restrictions accepted by community comparing like us and medicine? So as you mentioned, in medicine, randomized double-blind trial is a must. You're not it's not you're not taken seriously, not because I believe of course people somehow agreed, but then there is a rule this is how you expect to do research. In our community, this is not something which is valued, as I feel, and this is not something that they're in the rules. You can submit paper anywhere with how you feel is the right way to do human evaluations, for example. From your perspective, what is the biggest difference between medicine where it's established and we kind of refer it today so much like, and us who like, I mean, we also want like this, like we can do, we have resources, like it just like, if I can do simpler and this is going to be accepted, why should I do this extra step?
Yeah. I mean, I actually think the negative results thing is something which is, to me, is a really disappointing aspect of the AI community. If you're doing science and testing out ideas, sometimes the ideas work, sometimes they don't work. And from the point of view of progressing science as a whole, if it doesn't work, you should tell the community it doesn't work. And in medicine, that's accepted because they realize they're trying to figure out whether their treatments help people. And if you just have huge selection bias and publish the positive papers, not the negative papers, you're not going to be able to make a decision about does the treatment help people, right? And so again, in our field, I take to medical scribes, if we want to know do medical scribes help people, we have some papers that say they do, some that say they don't, and they should all be published so we can make good decisions and or reward modeling or whatever. So we should be publishing, saying, hey, we tried this cool idea and it didn't work. And that should be much easier to publish than it currently is in the AI community. And that's maybe the thing which annoys me, well, even more than the impact thing. It's hostile. We are hostile to negative results. And, people are, other people are saying this as well. And I know Anna Rogers set up her workshop on negative results to try to encourage people to talk about it. But yeah, it's still a struggle, unfortunately. Yeah.
Maybe follow-up comment. So we are facing an explosion of papers in AI, especially.
Yeah.
And if we include those kind of negative results, then we will, I don't know, maybe we'll double this explosion or even worse, because each one of us will have 10 ideas that will not work. Only one will work, will have an interesting impact. And thus we can even multiply those numbers of papers by 10 or even more. So who will review those papers? And this is a huge problem, I think, for the community of AI.
So I think we'd have fewer papers in general if people did careful evaluations. So, a negative result for sure is only valuable if evaluation was done very carefully, right? So I think if we had if we had higher expectations about the quality of evaluations, no matter how they're done, whether it's LLMs or geometric or whatever, we'd have a lot fewer papers.
That I agree.
And so I think that's the real problem, right? We need to have higher standards about evaluations, then that's the thing I would do. But, it's hard because I said I'm more involved in Tackle because I'm, helping edit that journal. So, but that's obviously a very different context from like ACL, where you have same numbers of papers being reviewed in like 2 months.
But that would lead to catastrophic events as well, because then you will steer researchers to work on things that will not take all this huge amount of time, which may lead to non-interesting results. So it will encourage me to work on theory, on doing anything except those that may have a real world impact, because then I have to do the evaluation, which unfortunately may lead to bad results. And so I will not do this kind of research anymore. It's too risky.
It depends on the individual, I guess. I just have a PhD student who's just submitted his thesis. We spent his entire thesis trying to develop an app to encourage safer driving in Nigeria, which is where he's from. And so after 3 years of work, he developed the app, he deployed it, and it helps, right? It really helps reduce the number of unsafe driving incidents among Nigerian drivers. And he's super excited, and he's going to try to get used in the real world. But he doesn't have a lot of publications, right? Now he's trying to publish. But during the 3 years he developed the app, he did just have like workshop papers and not very good conference papers. But, he wants to develop an app that really made a difference in the real world, and that's what he did. So it just really depends what your goals are as a researcher. So, but yeah, and again, it's another thing I really don't like about the community is the expectation that people have to publish huge numbers of papers, right? You don't see that in medicine, right? So I really wish that the community, the research culture, did not focus so much on lots of papers at these venues and more on small number of really, really important papers, but yeah, it's community, the culture of the community.
Any other question? Okay,
Are there any questions online or?
I think no chat and no raised hand.
Okay.
Okay, so I guess we can wrap up. Actually, maybe one thing just came up in my curiosity. Do you actually have an example of a paper that you consider a good real world impact or high impact paper in AI? Paper you remember about, or hopefully not from like 20 years ago, like now that the research community is like this, but
Well, I mean, one paper that really, really impressed me was the one I mentioned at the very beginning, right? About the health stuff. I mean, this is just one random one because I mentioned it, right? And that's not my paper. Sorry. This paper I really liked, right? Where they said, okay, we want to know, can GPT answer health questions? And so I thought it was a very careful study where they had one condition is recruit patient. They put a lot of effort finding, representative people. So not just like, with patients, some people are not very literate, some are confused, some are poor. And they tried really hard to get representative patients, right? Not just like students or rich people. And it was a very, to me, it was a very well, carefully designed study, which had a really important result. That these things fail, not because of lack of medical knowledge, but because patients get confused.
I think Irina has a question online.
Yeah,
Okay.
I mean, it's like not really a question, a comment. So in my opinion, our field has undergone major changes. When I started my scientific career, people had small data sets and they could provide high quality and many iterations with annotators and so on. But now our field has moved to big data and also the speed is much higher. And I think is not a problem actually that many benchmarks are noisy. I think the level of noise is something that can be discussed. It depends on the research questions. And I think it's important to quantify the level of noise, but it's unavoidable because we need large-scale, quick evaluations, and we need a proxy for the human. And if there are research questions that really target the real life deployment, then they need much more careful evaluation with real users. But many research questions do not really address the scope of the real life deployment, but are focused in some levels in between. And therefore, I will kind of contradict your claim that we need to target high quality benchmarks with no errors. It's just unrealistic. And I argue that many research questions do not require this level of perfection. It's just not feasible. So that's my stance. And yeah, I was wondering, like, how do you feel about it?
I mean, it certainly depends on the research question, right? But okay, so in terms of high quality benchmarks, right? Let's go to this. What did I mention this thing? Okay, this MMLU thing, right? So this was people being sloppy, right? Yeah, these benchmarks can't be perfect, but they could have done it a lot better than they do, right? So I think if you're going to release a benchmark, you have to try to make it a good benchmark, right? And lots of other people said the same thing, right? There's lots of papers in the space, criticizing benchmarks for, not being, not being valid, being saturated, not matching the right, the amount of people care about. So yeah, we need benchmarks, but I think if we're in the benchmark space, you need to take it seriously. And a lot of people, I think, are not. They're releasing benchmarks that are just sloppy. And that's also me, lots of people are saying that. So if you create a benchmark, take a lot of care about making sure it's a good benchmark in all, in all kinds of ways. So yeah.
So I
we need
agree that
benchmarks.
many people are sloppy, Ehud. I think it used always to be the case, but now the scale is much different. So that's why that's becoming disturbing. But I also think in many cases, it's not the sloppiness, at least like in our lab, we also release a large number of data sets and benchmarks. It's also a matter of constrained human and financial resources. So we need to, we need to make a compromise between what is perfect and what is feasible under constrained resources.
Sure.
So you see my point? It's not necessarily the sloppiness, at least I hope, but it's a decision that needs to be taken under resource constraints.
Sure. No, absolutely. But what I'm trying to say is when I look at benchmarks, right, and not just me, that's why we see lots and lots of problems, right? And so what you need to do as a benchmark developer is just be aware of all these issues and do the best you can. And there are real world constraints, but you need to do the best you can, and you need to also document, the issues, the limitations. Sometimes I had a frustrating example recently when I was reviewing a paper when they used one of my data sets, and in the data set paper would carefully say, here's all the limitations. When they kept using it, just ignored all the limitations, right? So that was kind of annoying. But anyway, as benchmark developer, just do the best you can and just be very explicit about what the limitations are. Yeah.
Maybe one interesting research I saw before, which is I think it was done on classification. So basically, they have an image classification and they shuffle the labels. So the output data set of this one is like a misleading one. It's meaningless. It's not just 10% of error, it's 80% of error. But something really remained, which is the ranking of the algorithm. So basically, it's not that the benchmark is correct or wrong. We should not read this as like 80% correctness, but we can read that algorithm A is actually better than algorithm B. So we use this benchmark to rank methods. This ranking, even though we have this 10% error, which can be 20% or whatever, if this ranking remains consistent, then I think the benchmark is useful.
Yeah, so we can use a noisy benchmark to rank models, provided that the noise is random, right? I mean, the danger is that the noise is not random, right? That some that some of the algorithms are affected more than others, right?
Exactly.
So if there's a bias, but so the risk is that the noise will impact some algorithms more than others. But sometimes that's all you can do, right? But I guess what I'm trying to say is I appreciate we're developing large-scale benchmarks. Yeah, it is part of the community. I'm just saying we just need to do is do this is the different talk, right? But we need to do it as carefully as we can. And what bugs me is I see people releasing benchmarks that should be better, and B, people using benchmarks without realizing their limitations. But yeah, I mean, we need them, make them as good as we can, and just be very careful when using them. And to me, also, I still believe we should be doing maybe even small-scale human evaluation just as a sanity check on the benchmarks. Just to see is it seem to be realistic or is it just totally off?
If there's no other question, let's thank again our speaker. Thank you for the people who joined the line. We do have a table. I overbooked it just in case for 14 people at India Spicy. So if someone who did not answer the form wants to join, we'll slowly get going there.